Chapter 20, The Economy, Expansionism, and World War One. This is the last chapter in our section on the time period from the end of Reconstruction through World War One. So we're going to focus a little bit more on the economy. The first chapter we talked about politics during the time period. In chapter 19, we talked more specifically about civil rights and the lack of them during this time period. Now we're going to move on and talk about the economy, but it's all the same time period. Um, this is a quote from a speech by Henry Grady from 1889 that he gave actually just a few weeks before he died at a rather early age. Listen to the speech and come prepared to class tomorrow to talk about what he means. He said, I attended a funeral in a Georgia county. It was a poor one gallust fellow. They buried him in the midst of a marble quarry. They cut through solid marble to make his grave, yet the little tombstone they put above him was from Vermont. They buried him in the midst of a pine forest, but his pine coffin was imported from Cincinnati. They buried him within touch of an iron mine, but the nails in his coffin and the iron in the shovel that dug his grave were from Pittsburgh. They buried him near some of the best sheep grazing country in the world, yet the wool in the coffin bands was brought from the North. They buried him in a New York coat, a Boston pair of shoes, a pair of breeches from Chicago, and a shirt from Cincinnati. Georgia furnished only the corpse and a hole in the ground. We're going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about the economy. Well, we're going to talk about the economy, and then we're going to talk about World War One. But within the section on the economy, we're going to cover agriculture, industrialization, and then urbanization and business. We'll start with the economy. This is a tune from the time period, Keep on the Sunny Side. By the late 1800s, Southern leaders, including Henry Grady, began to call for changes in the economy. They wanted a new South that would be more progressive and prosperous through better farming methods and more industry. So, in other words, they wanted to diversify. First, let's talk about agriculture. Cotton was still the main cash crop during the late 1800s. By 1880, one-third of Georgia's farmers were sharecroppers or tenant farmers. And like we've already talked about, one legacy of this system was long-term poverty. Once you fell into debt, and that was fairly easy to do, it was almost impossible to get out of debt. We'll take a look at these pictures in a little more detail in class. Middle-class farmers who fell into debt sold their land and became sharecroppers. So they went from being landowners to being on that lower totem pole. Landowners often demanded that tenants plant only cotton. So sharecroppers were often malnourished, which seems strange given that they were in the middle of farmland. Only the boll weevil was able to force farmers to diversify and plant different crops. Much more on the boll weevil to come later on. We're going to take a look at some of these images tomorrow in class, but I want to call your attention to this. This is a type of Southern vernacular architecture. The style of house is called a dog trot. We'll talk about it tomorrow, but what I want you to be thinking about is what would be the advantage of building a house like this in the South? That's your question. Why would that be a smart way to build a house? So come prepared to class to talk about it. Some farmers did begin to grow fruits and vegetables for market, truck farming, as opposed to just growing cotton. This is the time period, late 1800s, early 1900s, that peaches become a major crop in Georgia. This guy, Samuel Henry Rumpf, actually developed new varieties. He also developed a refrigerated carrier for peaches and a special kind of box that would allow farmers to get fresh peaches to markets quicker. So he's really the father of the modern peach industry. Pecans also became something that people grew for cash during this time period. And livestock, cows, hogs, and sheep. We'll do this in class tomorrow. Next, we need to talk about industrialization. The industries that emerged in the late 1800s were related to the raw materials that Georgia produced. For instance, Georgia has lots and lots and lots of pine trees. And so naval stores became a big part of industry, especially in further South Georgia. You have turpentine and lots of other kinds of products from the pitch and the rosin from pine trees. You also have lots of sawmills, and they're going to convert those pine trees to lumber. The other thing that's related to one of Georgia's products was the textile industry, which made cloth from cotton grown in Georgia. The fall line cities, Augusta, Columbus, had lots of textile mills. In Columbus, the Bibb mill was one of the famous ones, along with the Eagle and Phoenix mill. You also have during this time period the beginnings of some unions, some trade unions here in Columbus. We'll talk about them a little bit in class. We won't spend lots of time on those, though. Georgia held expositions to promote cotton and textiles, as opposed to just growing cotton. In 1895, the Cotton States and International Exposition was held in Atlanta. Booker T. Washington gave his famous Atlanta Compromise speech at that. It was like a giant industrial fair. One of the ways that textile mills developed was that a company would basically set up a self-contained community for their workers, a mill village. And it worked a little like farming and sharecropping did in agriculture. Workers would live in company houses. They would shop at company stores, and the children, when they went, would go to company schools. So in some ways, it was like the sharecropping in agriculture. Whole families ended up working for the mills, including children, and we'll talk about child labor. Some of the jobs that children did, they were something called dinner toters. We'll learn about that. Doffers and sweepers. We're going to talk about all of those things during class. There were also new businesses during this time period. You all know about Coca-Cola. It develops in the late 1800s and early 1900s, beginning with John Pemberton. It was purchased then by Asa Candler and then eventually by Ernest Woodruff. Royal Crown Cola also has a Columbus connection. It was developed by Claude Hatcher, a Columbus pharmacist. We'll take a look at a little more of the history of Royal Crown Cola. Tourism begins to become something that helps the Georgia economy. Northern industrialists bought Jekyll Island and spent winters, they were escaping the northern winters and would come and spend the winters in their cottages. The Carnegies were part of that group, and you know about them from Cumberland Island. Urbanization in business. We've talked about the fact several different times about people beginning to move to cities and towns during this time period. Railroads are a factor in this. Atlanta grew very quickly during this time period, and several of the new businesses were Alonzo Herndon's Atlanta Life Insurance Company. We learned about that in the last chapter. And Morris Rich began Rich's Department Stores, which was based in Atlanta forever and ever. Lots of your parents or grandparents might have very fond memories of shopping at Rich's in Atlanta. There began to be more and more differences between lives of people in cities and towns and people who lived out in the country. In cities and towns, by the late 1800s, early 1900s, folks had electricity, streetcars, indoor plumbing, and ice delivery, where ice would be brought and put in their ice box. We will talk about Buck Ice and Coal because they were the first company in Columbus to deliver ice to people. And that wraps it up for the first part of the chapter.